All right, this is going to be a throwback to the first movie macro back in the summer of 2022.
Yeah, the awkward positioning of two guys that don't have a microphone because somebody can't find the adapter for his iPhone.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm never getting an iPhone again. It's a real problem. It's also a girl's phone, but I don't want to get too political yet. Because we're going to be talking today about the 2018 film Sergei Loznitsa's Donbass. And it's an interesting film. I wouldn't necessarily call it a propaganda film, although in many respects, I guess it is. Maybe respond to some of the commentary that's been done on it over the years. Interestingly, it was actually just pretty much ignored for the most part until the Russian invasion in 2022. The film covers the Donbass region, the Civil War, that kind of thing. One of the primary points of Russian propaganda about the Civil War is that nobody actually cared, right? If you sort of ask people about the trade union house burning, the Civil War that's ongoing, the shelling of civilian infrastructure that was going on for 8-9 years and still ongoing now, and most people wouldn't actually know about it. And it's funny enough, nobody would really know about this movie until after the invasion, right? And now you have more emphasis on the Civil War.
Mm-hmm. It came out it got a wider release, I think, in April of 2022. So they scrambled to get this thing. I mean, maybe there was already a distribution planned, I don't know, but they scrambled to get this thing out, probably just to recoup some money on it, because I can't even remember seeing advertisements for this when it, first went to Cannes or whatever. So I can't imagine that they got a lot back from it. So certainly they thought they could capitalize on the war. I mean, maybe there was some good intentions on Loznitsa's part. Maybe he thought this would give some insight to Western audiences about what's going on there. But I would be a little more forthright in calling it propaganda than you, I think. I mean, whether its position on the Donbass is correct or not, it has a pretty firm position, which is that this is a region full of ignorant hayseeds that's been ginned up into hatred of their Western Ukrainian brothers by corrupt officials that are in the employ of the Russian government. So, I mean, there's not a lot of nuance there, not a lot of exploration of what are the cultural differences between the two parts of Ukraine that might have driven a point of separation that the Russians could geopolitically exploit in the first place. So, yeah, definitely a film of the that spring of 2022 time where the Hitlerian levels of evil of Vladimir Putin were at the tip of everybody's especially every media person's tongue.
One thing I'll say, I mean, the reason why I guess I'm not calling it totally propaganda is, well, a couple of reasons. First of all, overall, I'd say it's between a solid to a good film. It's not a bad film in the way that the first movie macro that we did, Clarasola, is just an outright bad film. There's definitely good scenes here, right? Yeah. There's plenty of good moments of scripting. There's plenty of good acting. There's plenty of good visual choices, that sort of thing. There are some interesting details in the narrative that are complex. So just by being, a higher than average caliber work of art, right, it's harder for me to just say, well, this is propaganda.
Yeah, no, I didn't say it was, the thing is, propaganda can be good. Yeah. It's not a great movie, but it's solid.
Maybe
to good.
Battle of Algiers is also kind of propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's definitely propaganda too. I'd say it's better than this, but this was kind of like cinematic Metamucil in a sense. It's probably not bad for you, and in fact is probably good for you. It has beneficial effects, but it is something that you are going to lose most of, not too long after you consume it. It's the kind of thing that you should have in your diet, if you're a certain kind of person, or you're just very conscious of certain physiological functions and the way that they play out in you. I'm pushing this metaphor too far, but it's good. It's a good watch. I'm just saying, the editorial slant of the director, I would say, is pretty clear. There's not a the only sympathetic Eastern Ukrainians in the whole movie are ones that are huddled inside of a bomb shelter, basically refusing to take part in any of the violence or to pick sides or to, you know, to embrace any of the regional sort of nationalism, sort of quasi-ethnic, I don't know what you call, like Donbass patriotism or whatever, the regional chauvinism that is really riling up a lot of the other people that we see in the movie.
Yeah, well, another detail, I guess, in terms of is this propaganda or not, is it is interesting to see how when it comes to, you know, for example, those bomb shelters or the shelling of the Donbass, that aspect of the Civil War, he is kind of accurately depicting not only Russian propaganda on this front, where, for example, the soldiers are, you know, they get a German journalist over and they're like, look, watch. This is what's going on in the Donbass. Women are hiding in shelters. Children are dying, right? We don't have electricity. And this was actually like a primary point of Russian propaganda for almost 10 years now. And
it makes you wonder why they didn't lead more with that when they did the actual invasion, you know, like the choice to go with denazification as like forefront justification that you presented to the rest of the world seems, I mean, I guess maybe it was necessitated because they had foregrounded that so much in their internal propaganda in the region in terms of what they were feeding the people.
Yeah.
So it had to sort of be at the vanguard of the justifications that they offered to the rest of the world. But, you know, it certainly seems less defensible than, hey, this region is poor as shit and the Western Ukrainian government's been throwing missiles at it and mining it and stuff for the last 10 years or whatever. I mean, even if you say that that's the Russians' fault, it's certainly a more sympathetic justification than, you know, the politically salient but nevertheless pretty small far-right movements in Western Ukraine and in Eastern Ukraine, you know.
And another aspect of this, just as far as introduction, is so Loznitsa's biography is along the lines of he's clearly someone that was like anti-Russian invasion. In fact, he resigned from what is like the European Academy of Film or something over the fact that when they released a statement after the invasion, it wasn't like sufficiently, there wasn't sufficient condemnation in his estimation. I haven't read the statement, so I don't exactly know what it was, but it might have been one of those things where it's like, you know, we stand with Ukraine as opposed to getting into some of the specifics. So he had that resignation because he was angry over that. But just a few days after this, he resigned from the...
No, he was kicked out, I think.
Well, there were a couple things. So I forget whether it was the European Film Academy or something in Ukraine, where some like one of these groups refused to screen Russian films, and he was like, well, I don't understand why that is happening. There's plenty of Russians that are against the war. There's plenty of Russian intellectuals in the West that are anti-war. Why is their work suddenly not going to be shown? This is unacceptable. So for saying that, he was kicked out of the Ukrainian Academy of Film. And then he started releasing a statement essentially saying this is Stalinism and this is Nazi behavior, which is, I mean, like it is very ironic, right? It is very similar to maybe like Russian commentary on this kind of behavior, right? And I mean, there is, because specifically they were highlighting his comments about being a cosmopolitan. You know, I'm a cosmopolitan.
Cosmopolite is the term that they use.
And he's correct in pointing out that that terminology, both in Nazi Germany as well as in Stalinist Russia, was it was first of all, like, there was this association obviously with the Jews, but there was also this kind of idea that this is a bourgeois bullshit kind of liberalism. But it also has, a nice confluence with some of the Russian commentary about either Nazism in Ukraine or Nazi tactics or whatnot. So I just found it kind of like an interesting sort of a case study in somebody that is in many respects a moderate. I mean, he's a moderate in the sense that he's against an illegal invasion. I mean, most people, I think, sort of would be, at least maybe in the West, and Well, depending on the type of illegal invasion, right?
Yeah.
Plenty of illegal invasions get a lot of cover in the West, which
Yeah.
is another point of Russian propaganda and Chinese propaganda and all of that you can't just
And one
easily
that's
shake.
just true. It's,
Yeah,
it's
that's
like,
why you
it's
can't
like
shake, 'cause
it's almost
true.
not even propaganda because it's just true.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
Well, but propaganda, I'm just
I know.
calling
I'm
it,
just saying,
in that
like,
technical
it's
sense.
but you know, it is propaganda that requires the least amount of tweaking by the propagandistic outlet to frame in the way that they want it to frame in the minds of the people that it's going to. You know.
Yeah, but
I mean, he just seems like a lib.
Yeah.
You know, just like he's you know,
a
he's
moderate,
someone that was
mainstream guy.
anti-Soviet like 30 years ago or whatever, and then, you know, he watched his country get taken over by oligarchs, and now he's anti-oligarch, but there isn't quite that, you know, deep leftist question, like, you know, like was the values that I opposed the Soviet Union in favor of, you know, was this a necessary consequence of this, or was this just you know, what was inevitably going to happen, you know, like opening my country up to basically be sold off piece by piece, which, you know, when there's as much state ownership as there was in the Soviet Union, you know, that's, if you break it up, that's just what's going to happen. You know, it's I mean, you see, I'm sure he's a nice enough guy, you know. I don't know if I want to phrase it like that. I mean, I'm sure he's a decent man or whatever, but I wouldn't say that he is like a deeply politically insightful person. But he is like a reasonably talented artist, I would say. So that is the central, I guess, motif or metaphor of the movie. Oddly enough, and this is a credit to it because it's an unexpected angle, is like stage management, basically. One of the first things that we see is this group of people that are in a trailer somewhere getting made up, and they're sort of giving each other shit about, you know, you don't look enough like a homeless person, you know, put more rings under my eyes so that the bags show
There's
more,
like
so I look more
Cassavetes
tired.
kind of banter going on, which is well done.
No, that's really nice. And then the first character outside of that group of characters is like basically the stage manager of this, you know, Alex Jones's nightmare, this like state crisis actor stage manager that comes in. It's like 5 minutes, let's get going. You know, we're done with the makeup. Get your props. You know, come on, they're about to start doing the shooting that you need to be there right after, so that our cameras can capture you talking about it.
It's actually not very obvious until you're there and they're being sort of interviewed, right?
It's not obvious what they're doing.
It starts out with this kind of John Cassavetes like sort of banter. One thing that I did think was a little bit forced, that was unnecessary, was like, this is what it says in the script. You have to do this, you have to do that. They sort of like repeat that a little too much, but you know, they get sort of like hustled out by somebody that has by a woman that's dressed as a civilian, but she has almost kind of like a military sort of presence. So they get hustled out. They have to keep running. They hear explosions, and you don't know exactly where they're going. And you know, whoever's handling the camera there is running with them. We see the kind of like shaking of the camera, right? It has this kind of like almost documentary feel to it, which is well done. And then it's only I guess a few minutes into all this where you realize, this is you know, a Russian false flag, where they're essentially interviewing these people. They're making them look like victims here, and all that. In terms of like the political aspect to that, I will say that although obviously false flags during the time that the movie was made, in 2018 or 2017, maybe some of the filming, obviously Russia would be in a greater position then to engage in false flags, because I mean they're the ones that essentially did take over Eastern Ukraine. And also, like, you see, like, later on in the scene where a man who gets accused of being a colluder or like a sniper gets sort of like tied to a pole as he gets beaten. Those two things, the false flags as well as these like public beatings, they're now strategies that Ukraine does employ. Like, Ukraine has been involved in any number of false flags, whether it's it seems like now, at least, the majority of the evidence does point to a false flag in the Maidan. So maybe like the false flag sort of started there with the Maidan massacre in February 2014. But more recently, you could find, I mean, plenty of videos of, you know, people in Ukraine being sort of made up, given sort of, you know, blood type of makeup, Because now there is like a wider sort of propaganda war. People were not really paying attention for the 8 or so years of the Civil War. They're paying a lot more attention now. So Ukraine now is in a position to engage both the false flags, but also these kind of public beatings, right? You see a lot of stuff now with, like either it's like women or men being tied to poles and either being jeered at, being kicked, being beaten, that kind of thing. And oftentimes it's under this kind of, totally, weird pretext of there's either an accusation of collusion or there's an accusation of looting. And it, obviously without like a sort of a court, investigation, you're not gonna know. Like sometimes you see women tied up. I mean, you could imagine like a spurned boyfriend or whatever being like, oh yeah, she did this or she did that. Yeah. I saw like stories of like old women being taken into, not being beaten, but being taken to police questioning because they took food aid from from Russia. And it's like, I mean, what do you expect? Like, this is simply the kinds of things that happen in war. So it is kind of interesting how the sort of things that maybe Russia started with, you now are seeing very similar tactics on the Ukrainian side, simply because, I mean, this is kind of what war more or less is. I don't want to say something like I don't blame them for engaging in this or that, because I mean, war crimes are war crimes, and mob mentality is always bad, but it's like it's also very predictable in that regard.
Yeah, well, I mean, good and bad almost. Yeah, I mean, I think I said this in a previous video, or at least I said it talking to you. If there is like a human experience that more perfectly embodies like the space of Nietzschean beyond good and evil or whatever, it's. I mean, whether the war itself is evil or not, like the things that you do to win a war, we're centuries past chivalry, like the idea that there are like some, and even chivalry was bullshit, but the idea that there is like some sort of rules that you follow that can make it, more or less moral or whatever, especially in the era of total war, where there is such an interspersal of military installations into civilian population centers in the modern world, that like basically anywhere that you shoot a bomb or whatever can be construed as a legitimate military target or whatever. And in the era of the car, where military tankers move on the same, military convoys move on the same roads as regular traffic, most of that is just a bullshit fig leaf, So I mean, it's just something that's gonna happen. I mean, we just live in such a paranoid country that I think probably a government would be less, more nervous about doing that here. But people still think everything's a fucking false flag. So it's, and in some sense that provides a cover for actual false flags, like these right wingers with their constant paranoia about false flags, like they are creating the space in which false flags can actually happen and go undetected, because the accusation in much of the West is always going to read as, this sort of far-right paranoia, this just reflexive anti-government position, and redound to the benefit of like basically make questioning the government itself a right-wing position. It's so silly. And there's a parallel, because this is one of the first scenes that we see, and then the very last scene that we see in the movie is these same people in the trailer again having a little banter, complaining that they didn't get paid for the last job. And this scene, I would say, is like not a very good ending scene, because it's very obvious and very predictable. They're getting made up, and they think that they're going to do another similar thing to the last time they did it, and instead of the stern-looking woman that was like the civilian-dressed woman with the military bearing that we saw earlier, it's an obvious like general or corporal or captain or what I don't know what the
that woman is also there.
Yeah, that woman, she is, yeah. But the head honcho is there as well. Yeah. And they're like, oh, when are we getting paid, man? He's like, be patient, whatever. And then he gets one of them to turn his backs, and he pulls out a gun and he starts killing everybody. And it turns out that they are the new false flag. He is massacring them and using it in order to get them out of the way. And so they can't tell anybody that they did that, and there's no evidence tying the military to that previous newscast, or maybe they did the attack itself and the whole thing was staged or whatever. so that there's nobody tying them to it, and then they stage it as like, oh, this massive murder happened here, and it's just a new, it's a new bit of stage management by which they can manage public perceptions in the region or whatever. I mean, that's not like a horrible conceptual idea for an ending, I guess, but the problem is it's just the second he walks in the room, you just know he's going to kill all of them. It's just it's such a predictive little narrative beat that, especially in a movie that has like some solid choices to end with something that is so predictable, really it brings it down a lot, and it really hammers the metaphor home a little too hard, instead of twisting in a different direction, it just sort of it hits you with the same thing, but like, oh, even if you think that you're benefiting from this government manipulation, you're actually in a position to be harmed by it. Like, well, fucking duh. Yeah. Duh. Like, what, you couldn't have unlocked something a little more interesting with the last moments of the film. I mean, the only good thing is that the credits play over the mundanity of it. That itself is a nice choice inside of a bad choice, but otherwise it shows both the good and the bad of the film, which is that there's a couple of like interesting artistic
there's also a guy
decisions.
that goes inside the trailer at the end, grabs some kind of bag, you don't know what it is, and just sort of like runs out.
Oh, I thought he was somebody that was arriving late and he saw what happened and he ran away. Well, like I thought, because he asked them,
he does not have a bag when he enters though, and then he escapes with some sort of object. So it's either like looting or like something else. But there's a little bit of mystery there, Yeah,
I thought it was like because the leader asked the woman, "Are all of them here?" And she sort of counts, and she's like, "Yeah, they're all here." And so I thought he was someone that was supposed to be there, and he showed up late, and he was freaked out, and he grabbed something and he ran away. I didn't, but he might have been in on it too.
It would be funny if the implication is here's another crisis actor, and the Russians are so evil and corrupt that even this guy who's so spooked that he could have been one of the ones killed, he can't help. He has to loot the corpses.
Yeah, that's so funny. Yeah.
All right, so now we're a little bit, closer together. We want to get a little closer for this next part.
Yeah.
So, I think we should tell everybody that maybe has not seen the movie. First of all, it is split up, depending on how you count, anywhere from like 13 to 17 different sort of discrete scenes. They're all kind of like loosely connected.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Robert Altman movie in that some of the characters from a previous vignette, or like a Raymond Carver novel or a short story collection where some of the characters from previous ones come back. But if most movies are like a novella or a novel, this is more like a short story collection, I would say. And
one detail that I guess non-speakers of Russian or Ukrainian would not pick up on is the fact that, so the vast majority of the movie is just in Russian, but there are some exceptions. So in the second scene that we get, it is all in Ukrainian. Later on, you have a scene where there's like a Ukrainian military checkpoint where you have a corrupt Russian official of some sort, or perhaps a separatist of some sort, speaking Russian to the Ukrainian soldier. The Ukrainian soldier speaks back in Ukrainian. At some point, I forget, I believe the separatist says some words in Polish as well. But anyway, so the vast majority of the movie is in Russian. There are some parts in Ukrainian. Now, I found that fascinating for a couple of reasons. So just to get into like the scene that is strictly Ukrainian, the second scene, so like, okay, after we get the crisis actors and they sort of say whatever they need to say in front of the camera, we immediately switch to some like village in, I believe it's Western Ukraine or Central Ukraine. And there's like some sort of conflict between a journalist and a politician that barges in to complain about like being, she says, you're lying about me in the newspaper. So she has like a bucket of some sort of shit, diarrhea looks like, and she dumps it on the head of one of the people inside the building. And so like this like argument erupts between her and another woman. And it struck me as like, all right, so the one place where there's like a substantial amount of Ukrainian in the film Loznitsa, he must have like felt the following, right? I'm just kind of like getting into his head, so I'm just kind of like making guesses here, but I can imagine the following transpire. So first of all, maybe he approaches it at the beginning with like, all right, I'm going to have maybe alternating Russian and Ukrainian scenes like this, but the first Russian scene, right, the very first scene with the crisis actors, the stakes are pretty high, right? We're talking about, you know, like war propaganda. In the second scene, there's like fairly non-specific complaints between a politician and journalists mutually accusing each other of stuff. And it's like this kind of like hokey, like, oh, you know, it's dear old, you know, Western Ukraine. We all know what the problem is. We all know that there's like corruption and all these like funny scenes, you know, with all these like ditzes and airheads. So we're gonna like dump some shit, you know, in this guy's head and, you know, all have like a big laugh about it. And nothing, you know, really transpires from that. It's kind of like the assumption is this is the extent of the problems that Ukraine is dealing with, right? It's just kind of like generic Russian-style corruption that as long as we get rid of that, you know, Ukraine is going to be, you know, a wonderful place to live.
Yeah.
You know, it's fairly non-specific. The stakes are very low. And I can imagine him thinking, okay, so maybe I'll start with this and maybe have some other Ukrainian scenes later. But it's like, well, if other Ukrainian scenes come and they're all in this kind of like very maybe humorous, hokey sort of scenarios, it's going to look just like pure propaganda, right? You know, it's going to, the distinction is going to be far too stark. Whereas, like, I mean, realistically, the problems between Russia and Ukraine, they all have very similar problems, right? They have a similar level of corruption. They don't have a Nazism problem in Russia like they do in Ukraine, but they do have like right-wing authoritarian fascist style problem in Russia, right? It doesn't get ideologically to the level of Nazism like you have in many parts of Ukraine, but still, like,
it may not be fascism, but it's still third positionism, you know?
yeah, exactly. So, you know, I can imagine like Loznitsa kind of like starting with this idea of some Ukrainian scenes, then just kind of abandoning it midway. But, you know, the scene is kind of like, I guess, humorous enough, and you know, like there is enough there where like
it's
he
bizarre
decided
to include, though. Really, like you just wonder why he didn't cut it. Like it has nothing to do with the rest of the movie. It's, I mean, tone is like a bullshit criterion for the most part, but if we're indulging it, then tonally it makes no sense with the rest of the movie. Like, and if you weren't going to do this sort of like alternating thing, it doesn't illuminate anything about the Donbass. It's not even clear that it takes place in the Donbass.
Yeah, I don't think it is.
Well, I don't know, because there's little titles, so maybe it does, but like it just doesn't have anything to do with anything. So who cares? Like take it out. Everything else is like life or death, and this is someone getting a bucket of shit dumped on them because they said that a politician was corrupt. You know, like.
Yeah, like I think a part of him does not want to be like a pure propagandist, you know, like I think a part of him does fancy himself very much an artist. And again, this is not a film that is like just like schlock, right? There are sufficiently good material here. So
the third scene is definitely better than the second, like bizarrely included scene. Basically, the premise of the third scene is this guy who is an official of some kind shows up to a maternity clinic that's been making complaints to the local authorities that they don't have food, they don't have supplies, they don't have any of the stuff that they need to run, basically. And he shows up, there's a big crowd of people, and he opens up this room that presumably they weren't allowed in, or that they couldn't go in, or something like that. He says, look, there's so much food in here. There's all this meat, there's sausages, there's bottles of water, there's so many potatoes that they're rotting. You know, the potatoes are rotting, the grain has rats in it, you know, like there's so much stuff in here. The problem isn't that we haven't been provisioning you, it's that your director was so corrupt that he was taking everything for himself and selling it on the black market. So he and his wife have been arrested. We've dealt with the problem. You have all of the supplies that you need now. Go with God. And they just sort of stand there listening to it, and it's the nice thing is it's a little hard to tell, like, no, they don't say anything, nobody really asks any questions, they just sort of have this like bemused look on their face, like they have no idea if this is true or not. Like it's quite possibly both true and false even, you know. It is quite possible that the government has been poorly provisioning the local maternity clinic, and that what they have been getting has been being siphoned off by a corrupt administrator, you know. And they just sort of have this look on their face like, okay, this is the line that we have to believe now. This is the story. Okay. Whatever, and they all leave the room, and then he goes into another room where there's a guy, and it's not clear to me if that is the guy that he was just talking shit about. And
yeah, he is.
Yeah, I think because there's a picture of him in the background, and I wasn't. Yeah, so basically, and I think the guy, the money changes hands. I can't remember. Does it go from the official to the doctor, or the doctor to the official? I can't.
I think it's the doctor to the official.
Okay, because he's there, so presumably people that just saw him, like, this was a little confusing to me.
Yeah, I mean, it was confusing to me.
Yeah,
right?
Like people that just saw him, like, it was claimed that he was like arrested and he was like horribly corrupt. Like how can he leave that office now with anybody? Like he's got to stay there until midnight when there's nobody there or whatever. Like, yeah, it's confusing. So, but basically, he I think the idea is that he has like agreed to be the fall guy or whatever, but in fact he is corrupt, and the doctor is paying the official, right? That's what we just determined. So
yeah,
so he's either paying him off to let him go, or he's paying the official like for the supplies that are buying him out of trouble, or like it's confusing exactly what happens. But and then basically and I guess maybe this segues into what you could call scene 4. The official then drives away in a very nice car, one of the only nice cars that you see in the entire movie, to the checkpoint between presumably the Donbass region and the rest of Ukraine, where he has an interaction with a checkpoint guy and hands him his papers, and the checkpoint guy basically just takes one look at him and hears his Russian and just is convinced that he's like got to be corrupt. Like there's got to be something going on with him. There's got to be something wrong. So
he also recognizes his face from somewhere else. And also, so this is another scene where there's some Ukrainian. The soldier is exclusively speaking Ukrainian, and the official is exclusively speaking Russian, although I think he also throws in, from what I remember, some Polish phrases too. And it is kind of, well, first of all, to go back a little bit to the earlier scene, there is this kind of like confusing element to all this. I think
like it's generally corrupt, but exactly what is the nature of the corruption is not entirely clear.
And I think this is one of the strengths of the film.
Yeah, it's good. I'm not complaining. It's just not clear.
So like, first of all, like many films or books or whatever with like a single word title tend to not be very good.
Yes.
I would make some exceptions, and this is one of the exceptions that I would make. It would be here, because if you guys saw the conversation I had with the Ukrainian scholar Ivan Kachanovsky, it was artifact number 37 or something. Yeah, it was, or whatever, 36. If you just go back, you'll see it.
30 question mark.
Yeah, so to prepare for that conversation, I hunted down this one book prior to the 2008 Georgia invasion by Russia, and it was basically a collection of academic essays about Ukraine, and it was titled Europe's Last Frontier. And whenever they spoke about the Donbass, they had some essays dedicated to pre-Civil War Donbass. It was always presented as this place that was mysterious, that was very kind of mercenary, that did not quite, it wasn't quite Russian, it wasn't quite Ukrainian. They, for instance, were not, the only reason why they joined the Bolsheviks was because they ultimately felt that the Bolsheviks would be able to improve their standard of living. When they decided to have this independence from the rest of Russia, they voted for independence, but at the same time, they expected a lot more independence also from the central Kyiv regime. They did not expect to be like under another centralized authority. So there's always been this kind of like feeling of the Donbass where this is where people go to escape to. This is where you disappear. I mean, you could still go there now and literally never be heard from again, right? It's kind of like a black box site in many ways. And historically, it's been like that for like at least a century, if not longer.
And the Soviets made it worse with like population transfers to that region too.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So, so ultimately, Donbass is this kind of like, as a concept, right? It works like that as a title. This like sort of like non-specific corruption that we get again and again, it works very much in that regard. So so let's move to this next scene of the checkpoint. So, well, I guess there's not much else to say. One is speaking.
I would say these two scenes are maybe the strongest stretch of the movie, like together. I mean, the checkpoint scene is, it's not, and actually maybe leading into the next scene after that as well. Like this is a part where the movie works pretty good. Yeah.
And one thing that was also interesting is how they were able to communicate with, because I mean, most Ukrainians and Russians, they if you live in Ukraine, right, you probably speak both languages. At the same time, I was kind of surprised to get back to the idea of a propaganda element. It's true that the soldier is kind of rude to the separatist official, but he's not as rude as I would imagine him to be. Like, especially now, I don't imagine if you get stopped at a checkpoint and they're speaking Ukrainian to you, and you insist on only speaking Russian, I don't think they're going to be as kind to you. And I don't think even in 2018, right, in this kind of like very emotional area in this part of the Donbass or whatever, I don't think they would have been as kind, right? I think there would have been a lot more.
He's not even rude. He's just very like stentorian and official, he's not at all kind to him, which I guess could be conceived as a form of rudeness.
Well, I mean, he says stuff like, stop fucking traveling, right? He does curse, he does...
I mean, that just seemed like good advice at the time, honestly, given what we see in the rest of the movie,
Yeah. So, so like, I would expect there to be a lot more both brusqueness and also just outright, maybe like slapping around, that kind of thing. And I mean, maybe that's a wrong assumption on my part, but I often like ask myself this question. All right, if you would end up, Alex, somewhere in Ukraine, would you rather be captured by the Russians or by the Ukrainians? I'm not 100% sure whether one is necessarily preferable to another. If you go by, so far the only objective metrics that we have are the human rights reports. If you guys recall, in 2022, in August or so, or July, Amnesty International released a human rights report condemning Ukraine for like a bunch of violations, and all these people just started flipping out, like, no, you can't do this, you can't release these kinds of reports, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, the facts on the ground say that you probably don't want to be a prisoner of war in either the Ukrainian side or the Russian side. So the fact that I saw a very gentle soldier with a guy that insisted only on speaking Russian, I'm not sure how totally realistic that was, but let's just put that aside and move on to the next scenes. So then there's the bus scene where some soldiers, separatist soldiers, get in, they sort of like check it out, and they sort of
let's set, I don't know if you're going to edit out the last part, so in case you don't, the setup of the scene is at the end of the checkpoint scene, after he lets the separatist official go by and says, stop fucking traveling, a bus coming from western or central Ukraine into Donetsk goes by, and they don't stop it at all. They just completely wave it by, don't even bother taking a look at it, because they don't really care like what goes into the Donetsk or the Donbass in general. They just care that the mayhem that's happening there doesn't poison the rest of the country or whatever. And this group of people are I guess they were refugees, and they're going back to see if their houses are still intact and if they can go re-inhabit where they were before. And they get stopped by a group of separatist soldiers who are led by a female commander who starts, they basically start dressing them down and saying, how dare you run away. Why aren't you in uniform? Why aren't you fighting? Men, strip down to your men, get out of the bus. Strip down to your waists. We're gonna see who's a decent soldier. That it's unclear if they're actually going to conscript them or if this is just like personal satisfaction in flagellating people that you have power over or whatever. But it's a nice little scene, especially the unexpected decision to have the commanding officer be a female who is castigating these men's masculinity.
Yeah, I believe at the time, and there was no conscription like that going on, and even right now, I mean, there's both conscription in Ukraine as well as Russia. They're both are you see a lot of in the West, right? In terms of Western propaganda, you see a lot of images of very old Russian soldiers being conscripted. But I mean, the same thing's happening obviously in Ukraine. Their conscription age right now is between 18 to 60. They've closed off all the borders. Men cannot leave of military age. They cannot leave Ukraine, I think, for pretty much any reason. Maybe that has changed, and also obviously it's a much smaller population. So it could have been just threats, but I thought it was a strong scene. A little bit when she started going more into kind of your motherland is sick, blah blah. That was kind of predictable, but before that, when they were asked why aren't you in the Donbass fighting, and one guy says something like, "Oh, my mom is sick," and she says, "Everyone's mother is sick. We all have a sick mother. One mother for us all." And I thought that was pretty strong and poetic. She sort of starts to veer into kind of the motherland, which is kind of more predictable, which I didn't think in terms of a purely kind of writerly perspective. It sort of disrupted a little bit, but it was a good scene. It was well written.
Yeah, it sort of ruins what the poesy of the because it's, you realize in retrospect that it's a setup for the not so good motherland line, whereas everyone's mom is sick is just a nice, almost like film noir, a little brusque, tossed off bon mot or whatever.
Everyone's mother is sick. One mother for us all, right? That you didn't have to go into you could by implication sort of start talking about motherland or whatever, but by not explicitly saying it, it would have been a lot stronger from a writerly perspective. So and so we go from there. So they lose interest in this busload of guys, and they put them back in.
Well, they lose interest because another car drives up and it's got a German journalist inside of it, and there's a German there, so they can call him a fascist, which, I mean, one thing that this movie goes to show is that the fascism thing was not just a 2022 invention by the Russians to justify the war. It was in fact a pretty omnipresent buzzword in this region of Ukraine.
For many, to this day, right?
Yeah.
It's not. It wasn't just. It wasn't just the invention. It's still obvious. Here's the thing. People don't really, they're not really, because when Westerners think of war, for the most part, I guess if you're in the UK or you're in Germany or whatever, right, you have, I guess, a more familiar understanding of direct war. But if you're an American, you don't really understand what 22, 23 million dead Russians is. I mean, it's not like Russia had a huge population anyway. It's only 140 million now, 150 million, probably going to be more now with the annexations of Ukraine or whatever. But 22, 23 million, 24 million, whatever the number is, dead Russians. That's a huge depopulation, right? A quarter of all Belarusians were killed in World War II. We have that number of a third of all European Jews, but similar numbers right across the board for Russia, for Belarus, right, that sort of thing. So that kind of psychology is going to be very fresh, and it's going to be very fresh because those wounds are still there. At a certain point, right, it is I don't want to be so judgmental about Russia in this regard, but at the same time, you do sort of think okay, well, it is true that Russia played this pivotal role in ending the war in Europe. This is true, but eventually maybe not just yet, like whatever, but eventually you're going to have to start talking about something else. You can't just rest your laurels on World War II forevermore.
Well, especially if you're not even the same political configuration that actually, I mean, it wasn't Russia, it was the Soviet Union. You know, it was a particular form of government, and it was a particular like political configuration of like different states and whatever in the region. So, you know, I mean, you can't, you know, basically sell off the entire patrimony of the Soviet Union to the highest bidder and then nevertheless take on all their accomplishments, like, you know, vampirically. You know, it's, I mean, even if there is something to be proud of there, you know, in terms of ethnic heritage or whatever, and literal family connections, it's just, you know, but it's you got to get a new thing. You know, eventually, and you can't use it as a palliative for the fact that like your current country is not like especially you know, not especially praiseworthy, where like fucking Alexander Dugin is like the most prominent international philosopher that you can voice on the world stage or whatever.
I should do a bigger video or whatever on Alexander Dugin. It's just that honestly there's just not that much there. I always get, like, whenever somebody talks about like, oh, I have like you know, another way. It doesn't have, we don't have to have liberalism, we don't have to have fascism, we don't have to have Marxism, we could do something else. And then you read it and it's like the same old shit essentially.
It's always just a different kind of fascism, basically. Like, it's weird, it's always weird fascism. It's always like, oh, it's fascism where the in-group is people that floss their teeth or whatever. You know, it's always
So, I mean, a part of me, you know, also being Russian, right, I am sensitive to World War II. I obviously get like floods of emotion when I hear, you know, the kind of like, you know, the Soviet music during World War II, that kind of thing. But at the same time, like, you do have to be objective, right? And you do have to say, you can't talk about this forever. So anyway, they catch this German journalist. They start yelling, oh, we caught a fascist, we caught a fascist. They're kind of like making fun of him. And I think there's also a particularly strong scene here where eventually it moves to the separatist soldiers, and they're being asked like, oh, you know, can I speak to your commander? Like, are you the commander? And then like one of them starts laughing. What? I'm the commander? No way, he's the commander, pointing to like a random soldier. And it's like, what? No, I'm not the commander. Ask him. He's the senior here. It's like, me? You must have lost your mind. And they kind of keep going around, and it captures perfectly not only kind of like the Russian style sort of propaganda here, but also again like the trappings of like what is Donbass, like what is real, what is not. You know, I thought
it's also
that
just
was a
good
very strong
soldierly
scene too.
banter.
Exactly.
You know, it's just good, like, you know, like that's how fucking soldiers talk in any era. You know, like if you're not one of them, then they feel a little free to fuck with you. You know, and there's such a cohesion that is created by going into battle with somebody that they just instantly can come up with a bit, and everybody like plays along with it perfectly. You know, and then the actual commander is like this old guy with a beard who looks like he looks like he should be homeless. You know,
well,
like
he's probably not even the commander.
He's just a guy.
Well, he's a guy. He's kind of like a mascot.
He's the guy that choose. He's the guy they choose to be the commander to talk to the journalist.
He's essentially the mascot.
And he starts talking about fascism again.
He starts screaming about it until maybe.
And he's actually old enough that, I mean, he's not old enough to have fought, but like to have been a kid maybe, or to have known veterans or whatever. So
yes, and there's also another part of the scene where the journalist turns to some other soldiers who are dressed slightly differently. And they're like, oh, are you with them? Where are you from? And he starts laughing. Oh, I'm from a nearby village. And it's the obvious reference is it's actually Russian soldiers that are like the little green men. They're like not supposed to be there, right? If you guys recall the Crimean annexation, the way it happened was there were like already a bunch of Russian, like it didn't happen as in, like, people forget this part, but in Crimea there were already a bunch of soldiers there, right? So when it came time to take it over, it was just kind of like, okay, well, we're here and we decide, since we're the power here, this is now ours, right? And later on soldiers ended up coming. So
and the nice thing is that you don't know if they're actually Russians or if they're just fucking with this foreign journalist, like feeding him the line that they know he wants to hear or whatever, you know, that this is just a bunch of Russians that have been imported in or whatever. And we didn't talk about in my opinion, the searing image of this movie to me that will probably actually stick with me is that guy finding the jar of pickles and guys just like reaching their hand in this jar of pickles and drinking the pickle juice straight out of the jar and handing it to each other.
Fucking good. I remember my great grandfather who was in World War II. I remember one time when I was small, he would always tell me like war stories, and I remember one time he was asleep. And I heard him like talking in his sleep, and he was like, "Oi, ogurchiki," which means pickles. He just kept like muttering, like, "Oh, pickles."
Do you drink the pickle juice out of the jar, brother?
Well, that's the thing. If I get like actual Russian pickles, I would. American type pickles or European type pickles do taste different to me, and I'm less enthusiastic about American pickles, but. I would. I'm not. My wife drinks kimchi juice. I'm like, oh, what are you doing? She's drinking the actual juice.
No, pickles are a very like it's like a national or a regional like Proust Madeleine, you know, because my wife can't stand any pickles that aren't either Persian pickles or at least Middle Eastern pickles.
All right. So the next scene is in the bomb shelter, and it is an interesting scene because first of all it is kind of it is kind of unpredictable, right, in the sense that it begins with the typical. I mean, I did kind of like a live stream of the Donbass film by this French journalist from a few years ago. She did this film just kind of going through these bomb shelters and interviewing the people there. And the people there are just kind of shocked, like, no, you're never going to actually show this to the rest of the world, right? We're going to be forgotten. So here it's kind of like a similar kind of conceit where we're being taken to the shelters, and you see, you know, the water often isn't working, the heat isn't working, people are just kind of, you know, living in very squalid conditions, and it's presented kind of, you know, without comment. And
there's a little of that stage management motif that shows up because it seems like it's supposed to be a documentary, but there's no, like, you never see the quote-unquote documentarian or whatever, and the guy keeps looking at the camera, which was something that happened earlier, too, when they were doing the crisis actor scene. Like, the female military official, as she was guiding them away, she kept looking at the camera as well, so there is a little bit, like... There is a running motif of like sort of people's awareness of like the media and of like the coverage or whatever as like almost an omnipresent character that they are interacting with.
Yeah, and like a few minutes into all this, a woman shows up, and she's I mean, I've known many Russian women like this. She's clearly like pretty bougie. She has jewelry, she has nice clothes, she brings a bunch of groceries essentially to her mother who's in the shelter, and she keeps saying like, you know, why are you here? Or she keeps saying that we know why you're here. You don't have to be here. You don't have to live like with these people, right? You don't have to live in these squalid conditions. You could go back with me. Everybody keeps asking me, why are you here, right? This is embarrassing, stop it. And she eventually just totally loses her mind, starts banging on the metal door. Her mother, for whatever reason, seems to not want to have anything to do with her. And, you know, I guess there's a few different ways to interpret the scene. To me, like, I guess the most immediate thing is maybe her mother is here because she is like fed up with her daughter in terms of like when the daughter ultimately like goes back to the office and does not have the mother with her, the person with her says something like threatening, like, you want me to like get a few guys and bring her back with us, kind of like, you know, he is kind of like a mafia type. I mean, the whole, you know, like you know, all of Ukraine, but particularly Eastern Ukraine after the Civil War started, you know, it's very much like run by cartels, right? This is like a cartel type guy who's, you know, she calls him like stupid because, I mean, she knows that he's making a joke, but she doesn't like that kind of joke, obviously. And
well, it's like she's in the local, you know, separatist government or quasi-government or whatever, and it's embarrassing to her that her mother is like holed up in this bomb shelter instead of, you know, because it makes her look, it like calls into question the legitimacy of her position. Like, you know, her mother is not embracing this new government or what, because she's getting paid, you know. She even says they have a servant there to cook and clean for them and stuff like that. So, you know, if she can't even convince her mother to participate in this, then like how can she be legitimately a government official or whatever? So there's like a, not just an interpersonal element, but just like a political element too. Like it's undermining of the local government for her mother to stay in this fucking bomb shelter with these, you know, just very like traumatized looking people all around. And I will say that this, like, there's good, the actual bomb shelter scene itself is like, you know, it's pretty good, like the quasi-documentary aspect of it. And you may say, you know, like Russian women like this or whatever, but there's this weird dichotomy where like the guy who plays the corrupt official in the beginning of the movie, you know, he's pretty good. Like you understand, like he's pretty charming, you know, like you understand he's like a survivor or whatever, you understand like, but this one was just like a total like exploding caricature, you know. And like there's a like theoretically in the movie, I mean, it's not clear if the camera actually exists or not, or if that's like just a magical realism flourish or whatever, but like there's a camera there filming her and she's like having this meltdown like with somebody filming her, and there's just not a lot, you know. And like by this point in the movie, I think this is like an hour into the movie, like you have pretty clearly internalized like there's some good stuff here, but it's not a great movie because these are often pretty caricatured characters, and there's not really any like there's moments that are like poetic or like, you know, interestingly juxtaposition or whatever, but there's no depth to any of it really. Like there's not anything more to it than what you get on the surface of what's happening.
I mean, I thought that her acting was actually pretty good in that scene. Again, simply back to this idea of just growing up and hearing, you know, anything from normal talk to
but even the way
yelling.
her like makeup was done, like was sort of like this over the top, like bougie, whatever. And it's the same thing with the wedding later in the movie too. Like they look like just these like grotesque caricatures of like, you know, it reminds me of like some of the Nazi ministers in Downfall as well. Like they're done up to look like so grotesque and you know, just detestable or whatever, that the good in the same way that like the good historical aspects of that movie kind of get undermined by like the unnecessary caricaturization, like the quasi-documentarian or cinema verite aspects of this that are done well are undermined by some of the more, like, even if it's true, like, you know, art is not true, you know, like it's all about like wisdom of inclusion and how you prune it or whatever. So like, I mean, it's not terrible, it's not like, you know, totally jarring, but that's, you know, it's in the totality of the movie, it's like there's some officials that seem like real people and there's some officials that seem like grotesque caricatures, and she's more toward that polarity to me.
Well, one thing that is kind of fascinating is just, you know, to get back to the second scene with the all kind of Ukrainian, although they're yelling in Ukrainian, they're arguing in Ukrainian, all the kind of mannerisms and all the kind of like the specific types of insults and the like just kind of like modes of doing all that, it reminds me like so much of just kind of like what Russians do. Yeah. Right. I don't know to what extent this is kind of like, I mean, because, you know, Ukrainian and Russian are pretty close. They are mutually intelligible, right? If I turn on, for instance, like Ukrainian TV, I'm able to understand most of it, even if I can't speak it. And I wonder to what extent this is kind of like, well, anything that's kind of like linguistically close, like maybe like Sweden, Norway. I believe Swedish and Norwegian are mutually intelligible as well.
I would imagine there's like those Scandinavian countries, it's like a gradient, like each one can kind of understand the country next to them or whatever.
I wonder how much of this is like linguistic proximity versus kind of cultural proximity, because I mean, you know, there's been so much interplay between Russia and Ukraine for such a long time. You know, during the USSR, like moving to Ukraine, it was kind of like moving to like a different state or whatever, like here.
Well, there's a reason that the Slavic world can kind of fall under the rubric of Orientalism, like in some readings of that term, because there is a certain cultural commonality that extends across the region. If you just, I mean, I know this more as an American interacting with them, but as a nurse, like anybody that is like, just from that whole, like, you know, region of the world, basically, there is like something common to like the character or the way they talk or like the cadence of their speech and certain, just, you know, there is something that carries over even between different languages and people in different places. So then it transitions to this group of soldiers that are getting chewed out by this commanding officer, and there's like 2 other soldiers that are set off from them, like behind him, and he's saying like, you don't leave the base, and we based on what we've seen, the base might just be like some bombed out buildings that they're holed up in, or what. You don't leave the base unless you get permission, blah blah blah. And then it turns out that these 2 guys that are behind him, they got in trouble for stealing a cell phone from someone in the local region, so he gets these soldiers together with giant sticks, and he tells them, he basically has him walk through a line past the soldiers and get the shit beaten out of him. And he sort of threatens him, let's do it one more time. But then he asks them about the other guy, and they say, let's show him mercy. It's his first time or whatever. And it's, it's a good scene. It's a nice bit of masculinity in the movie, just like the way that, like there's something I think guys, I think, like if my wife watched that scene with me, she'd be like, oh, this is like so barbaric, like the way these people, and I like, I'm not a soldier, but just as a guy, I understand like the dynamic there, like that's the like when you wrong the group or whatever, like that's the kind, whether it's like giving someone shit or just like actually like you get like hit or whatever, like there's something that that is like under my skin intuitively makes sense to me about that scene.
I don't have too much. I mean, there's some good imagery there.
It's not great. It's just the movie kind of. I think the other aspect, like you realize it's not going to be a great movie, is it does start to get a little repetitive after a certain point. Like I think the next scene is some people packing up in a car and getting on the road during the day, and it kind of lingers on the little farm where they have like packed up these vehicles or whatever. And then they're driving, and an RPG comes from like the right side of the frame and just blows the last car up. And some people run up with machine guns and kill the people, like the survivors in the car. And then a different car comes up, and they get in and they drive away. And it's fine. It's functional. I wouldn't say it's great. The thing that's, I guess, kind of a good artistic decision, even if it doesn't necessarily add to it that much, is that you don't exactly know whose side they're on. Like, you don't really know, like, which military did what. Like, you don't know who did what. It's just like some people getting in these military convoys, and then a different group of people attack them and drive away or whatever, So that scene's fine, and it doesn't. An interesting thing is that almost nobody in the movie has a name. Like even in the end credits, there's just like guy in jacket, first doctor, a fat woman or something like that. It's almost like a.
What about the scene with the beating of the man that gets tied up? Right, the kind of thing that's
that's probably the marquee scene of the movie. It's certainly the one that, when I was reading reviews of the movie, seems to get the most mention. It's a good scene. It's interesting because in some ways it feels like the most propagandistic scene in some ways too, because it's not just like, it's not just about soldiers that have bought into the propaganda enough to actually sign up to fight or whatever. It's just like regular people driving by in cars or whatever, or people walking by, people waiting at bus stops or whatever. They get so ginned up at the idea that this is either a Western Ukrainian guy or a Donbass guy that signed up to work with the Western Ukrainians or whatever, that they just start just beating the ever-loving shit out of him. And the soldiers that have tied him up and put the sign around his neck, they keep trying to intervene, like enough, but they're clearly also like just doing it enough that they have plausible deniability. Like this is clearly what they want. Like they clearly want this kind of treatment of the guy. And maybe I didn't explain it correctly. The idea is that there is a guy that is walked up with his hands tied behind his back that has a sign on that says like executioner squad or something like that. He's being claimed to be a sniper, or he did something. And all of the people that see this, these people that have trauma, that have seen their children die, or they have, they're young guys that aren't fighting, but maybe they kind of wish they were, or they get off on seeing that it's happening or whatever. They just start beating this guy up, but it's all done as one long continuous take. So there's kind of an effect to it of just like seeing this crowd mass like over the course of minutes or whatever. It's in terms of having not really documentary feel, but almost more of like a cinema verite feel or something like that. It's a good scene, but it does make these people look like ignorant, just like hayseeds that have like, you know, like totally had the hate in their hearts twisted by their masters or whatever, and are just being tricked into the easiest.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I think that's partly true, but there's also an aspect to it where it's like you clearly see, for example, like, you know,
they're women, actually hurting too.
Yeah, the women and the mothers are kind of like, you know, just tell me one thing, tell me who sent you. And it's not really, you know, it's not that they were manipulated. They were actually living with, you know, years and years of civil war.
Well, yeah, but the only people we've seen leading them are just like absolute, like no leader that had like a good reason to want to separate from Western Ukraine or establish autonomy has been seen to that point. So even if, you know, their pain is real and what they've been exposed to is real, there has not been a whiff of legitimacy to the complaints that started the conflict in the first place that has been represented in the movie up to that point. I think that's what I mean, is like, and it's like a marquee scene artistically because there is something powerful about it, and it's the one that got the most mention in the critical reactions to the movie that I saw, both at the time that it was done and then when it was re-released or released to the West or whatever in 2022. But the fact that there hasn't really been like a good faith representation of the Donbass separatist position up to that point makes it look like, you know, just makes them look like these bumpkins that are just doing the bidding of these like corrupt shitheads or whatever.
I mean, to some extent, we were saying this before we started filming, there's definitely something to this idea of a bumpkin type of quality to the leadership, because if you watch documentaries and footage of the Donbass, like during like the start of the Civil War and into the Civil War, I mean, these people like, so first of all, I would separate the idea of, you know, not all these people necessarily want to be part of Russia. I can easily imagine a situation, especially if some things go haywire in the war, where, you know, Russia kind of like loses control of the Donbass, but Ukraine would not be able to necessarily recapture it. Russia wouldn't necessarily be able to have it because, you know, there are, you know, sufficiently powerful cartels in that part of Ukraine where they kind of want to do their own thing, right? There's been plenty of assassinations of both, you know, Russian-backed leaders and also people that are more independent in Eastern Ukraine, that maybe they want to work with the Russian government, but they don't necessarily want to be under the thumb of Russia. This is like an actual like thing that doesn't get, you know, sufficient treatment in the Western press, like the complexities of what exactly. Because I mean, like if you really look at the history of Ukraine after the collapse of the USSR, the cartel problem is at least as bad as it was in 1990s Russia, if not worse, right? I mean, like, look, Yanukovych was, you know, a classic, you know, like oligarch. All these people were like, you know, in their own ways, oligarchs, right? So that's definitely an aspect to it. But in terms of like this bumpkin quality, like if you look at that footage, there's definitely like plenty of characters, right? Like real life people. Like there was this one guy named Lenin who, it was kind of like an affectionate name, but it's clear that he was like somebody that didn't really know anything. And eventually when like actual like powerful separatists came by and sort of like took power away from him, so like, you're not gonna be part of this government, like this is our thing. He was like pacing around. I remember like some apartment, just asking to himself like, what would Lenin do? What would Lenin do? What would Lenin do? You know, just like total. And like there was like another, I remember like documentary where they showed like one separatist that I guess was never in Russia before. It was like a Ukrainian. But this separatist like went to like this wall and decided to like paint the Russian flag, and then some girl was like, no, what are you doing? Those are not the colors of the Russian flags. Like he literally didn't know what the colors of the Russian flag were. So
that's
there's
so funny.
Yeah, there's definitely a quality to the separatist movement where there's definitely like bumpkins and weirdos and characters, right? Besides like, you know, the Russian aspect of things. But I think the bumpkin thing really comes out in like one of the later scenes where You have that wedding. I think it's maybe one of the most pointless.
That scene was awful.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
That was really
it's
bad
definitely
inclusion.
like the Ukrainian language scene, the second scene with the shit bucket. At least it's kind of humorous, and if you speak Russian or Ukrainian, some of the intonations and other stuff is kind of funny. But the wedding scene, like, it just strikes me as, you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of, you remember, like, during, like, the peak Trump hysteria, during, like, right at the end of 2016 into, like, the first half of 2017, where liberal media was, like, really going out of its way to, like, paint as, like, a negative picture as possible of, like, rednecks and all this other shit.
Yeah.
So, like, the people being represented in this wedding scene are essentially the equivalent of, like, Russian rednecks. Like, even the names, like, it's often a trope where in Russian media, their last names are just kind of funny, because literally in Russian, you often do have funny names. Like, I remember, like, one time reading a biography of this guy, the Soviet bard Alexander Galich, and when I was reading it, there was a name called Arbuzov, and I just, like, stopped in the middle of it. I was like, what the fuck? This guy's last name is Watermelon. It was literally, his last name was literally Watermelon.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's just a thing. Like, that's like a country thing. That's like the old Chapel joke that every right winger's name is like Blort Blinton or something like that.
But it's literally true. Like, there are very often, like, funny Russian last names, and so this guy's last name is Yaichnitsa, which is the Russian name for, like, scrambled eggs.
Yeah.
Right?
And even the subtitles.
It was like something like omelette scrambled.
They don't even tell you that they're translating it. They keep saying that he's like Arshevsky fried egg or something like that.
They just call him fried egg.
Yeah.
But it's clearly meant to just, like, totally make fun of, like, very much kind of like Russian hicks, right? But it has that sort of nasty, peak, shit-lib 2016, 2017 resistance media quality to it that rubbed me the wrong way. Because, I mean, I know Russian bumpkins. I know people that live in, the Belarusian countryside, and it's hard, right? It's a hard fucking existence, right? It's not an existence that any of these people would ever be able to live through, right? They would just fucking die, right? So when I see that kind of thing, right, it applies to America, but, it would also apply to Russia or Ukraine. And that's the thing, like, it would be one thing, like I was saying this before when I had that conversation with, Arnold Schroeder, when I was like, the offensiveness is never the problem to me. It's like, if you want to be offensive, fine, but being offensive is just kind of like, it's the license that you are given when you present something of objective value. If you're a great comedian and you're offensive, fine, but you present objectively great humor alongside.
Yeah, this wasn't even funny.
Yeah, it wasn't funny. There was no insight. It was just there to just kind of make fun of these people. But I mean, we're more or less like at the end of the film. We already covered the ending at the beginning. Is it propaganda? Yes or no? Definitely large amounts of propaganda. But the director is definitely someone that fancies himself as more than a propagandist, and it comes out in the better parts of the film. There's definitely good scenes. There's definitely good writing in different parts. It doesn't really cohere in the way that it ought to. In the hands of a better director, this could easily be a great film. I can imagine it being that way. But as it stands, it's solid, good, and doesn't go much further.
Yeah. Have you seen? Who is that? I think he's a Swedish director. He did You the Living. He did A Pigeon Sat on a Branch Reflecting on Existence. What the hell is this? Roy Anderson?
No,
I think his name. Like, if you're gonna do something like that wedding scene, you got to really really push it farther. Like, if it's got to be just totally alien, like out of this world. Like if it had been funny, if it had been like somebody's dream or something like that, like this is what a Western Ukrainian official is dreaming about, like in the Donbass or something like that, like you could redeem it or something. But I mean, it's just emblematic of the whole movie. It's like, it's hot and cold. It's like there's a scene that is, I mean, none of it is great, but there are scenes that like have some power and have some oomph to them, and then there's just scenes where you're like, this is pointless, and then there's scenes where you're like, this is grotesque. Why am I watching this? And you know, it's just, I mean, for better or worse, it's a movie made by a Ukrainian liberal before the Russian invasion. You know, it's the best and the worst of what is possible in that worldview, I guess.
Yeah. All right. Well, maybe we'll end it here. We're gonna do another. We're gonna do a walk and talk together after this. But now we gotta eat, right? Because I made homemade sangria. It's a we got two Cara oranges, right? One in each bottle. I put a shot of brandy in each. We got a bunch of wine, and I'm very hungry. I already worked out. I had a big long walk in the morning. I barely ate, and my hand really hurts holding up this phone. So we're gonna put an end to this now, and I guess, you know, patrons, you're gonna get something, and the general public, you're gonna get a couple of videos out of this too. So hope you guys have enjoyed Movie Macro number 7. I wanna get Keith to commit to 6 more Movie Macros over the next 2.5 months.
Well, we got the weather for it. So.
Yeah, I like to do these in the park, right? There's more sort of like interplay and fun, right? If we could do something like this, and hopefully I could
do it in person together too. Yeah.
Yeah. So and maybe I could get I could find that adapter again for the mic. Yeah. So all right, we're gonna eat, and we'll see you guys soon.
All right. Peace.